The memory verse for our Bible bowlers is 2 Samuel 15 and verse 30. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. I think I'll mention this now. There's an interesting, those genealogies in 1st and 2nd Chronicles can be kind of wearisome to read through it all, but when you pay attention, some names familiar to you will come up. And it's in there that we'll learn that Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba. Just think about what David had done with Bathsheba in taking advantage of her and killing her husband and taking her as her own. If you were a grandfather and someone did that to your granddaughter, how would you feel about that? Well, this might explain partly why Ahithophel wanted to go over to David's son in raising this conspiracy against David, and then something else we're going to learn about him as we go on. There's a strange thing happens to Ahithophel in the next few chapters, and this might help explain that. So that's not part of this chapter, but kind of keep that in mind, if you will, to see how this story might develop. Now let's look at the names that we're going to come across in this chapter. These are characters, some of them we'll meet later. Absalom, Ahithophel, David, Ittai, Zadok, Abiathar, Ahimaaz, Jonathan, and Hushai. It sounds sort of like touche, doesn't it? So I think the right pronunciation is Hushai on his name. And then watch for these places. Can you put these places on a map in your head? Hebron, Geshur in Syria, Jerusalem, Gil'o, Gath, the brook Kidron, and Mount Olivet. Let me show you where those are. The one you might have trouble with here is Gilho, if you might have a little trouble placing that one. Here's where we're looking at them. That lowest arrow, that would be Hebron. Moving up from there, the arrow's pointing off straight there. There's Gath. That's a Philistine city. Remember Goliath of Gath. And then you go on up and there's Jerusalem. That arrow that's kind of slanted toward to there, it's not on that map. But that's the approximate area where I've been able to locate Gilho, according to the sources that I checked. It's about in that area there. Geshur then is up there toward Syria, up there toward Damascus, in that arrow toward the top. And I looked for a map of the city of David, and I couldn't find it. I found this map of Jerusalem in the time of Christ. I don't know how well you'll be able to see the topography on that map, but that part circled in yellow is the part that is called the city of David. And if you look between that city and the rest of the larger city, the city grew. It was much larger during the time of Christ than it was in the time of great David. But that is a narrow little ridge that sticks out there where David's city was. He chose that as a place easy to defend. You'd have to march up the hill on 3 sides and then a narrow gap to defend on the far side. And so it was like a fortress he had up there. That'd be the city of David. The arrow pointing down is the brook Kidron. And you'll know that Jesus crossed this brook. And David is going to in this chapter. And then the arrow pointing up is pointing up to the Mount of Olives, called Mount Olivet in this chapter. So I give you a little zeroing in on what was happening in Jerusalem there at that time. Now let's get into the text itself and see how this story develops. It says, it came to pass after this that Absalom prepared himself chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. He has now been kissed by David and accepted as his son, and he is setting himself up as a great one, having this chariot and all these 50 men going with him where he goes. So his entourage, you might call it. And Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so that when any man had a controversy, came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant is of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there's no man deputy to the king to hear thee. Absalom's heading them off. They would come to the king with their problems, with the application of the law and what should be done, beseeching him. And Absalom, the king, he doesn't care about you. He hadn't even said anybody to hear you. But boy, if I was king, you've got a good case here. You've really got a good case. And then he goes on, and Absalom said, Moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come to me, and I'd do him justice. Doesn't that sound just like a politician? I tell you, it doesn't matter what party you're in or whoever's in office, there's going to be problems. And whatever official is dealing with that problem, the one that wants to replace him is saying, Oh, if I was in that position, this never would happen. Or if I was in there, I could take care of that. And then they get in there, they have their own problems too. So Absalom's kind of playing the politician here. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. Well, on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. It's amazing to me that he could undermine his father so quickly in this manner. For David, I always thought that people thought he was a great king, but Absalom was able to steal their hearts away from David, bring them to himself. It came to pass after 40 years. Now what that 40 years is that 40 years from, I don't know what time that's beginning with. Absalom wasn't doing this for 40 years. Maybe it's 40 years from the time David was anointed king or something like that. But after 40 years, that Absalom said to the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode in Geshur in Syria, saying, If the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. And the king said unto him, Go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. I want you to remember, Hebron is where David had been king for 7.5 years before he became king in Jerusalem. And David seems absolutely clueless about what Absalom's up to, very trusting of this charismatic son he has. Go in peace. Go pay your vows to the Lord in Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. Well, Absalom went with 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity. They knew not anything. They didn't know what they were getting into. He took those 200 men away from David, didn't he? He wouldn't have those 200 men to guard David. He took them with him to Hebron, and these men just went along with it, not knowing that a conspiracy was afloat. Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. And there came a messenger to David saying, The hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee. Now notice why David's going to flee. We shall not escape from Absalom. In other words, he thought, boy, Absalom, he's got a plot. He's expecting to find me here. We better flee. And that way he won't be able to implement whatever plot he has with me against me here. He said, make speed depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. David wasn't going to have his men die defending Jerusalem. He thought it would be better to take off and then find out what he could do from another location in regaining his kingdom. Well, the king's servant said unto the king, behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. And the king went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. Well, that's going to be a mistake. Look at verse 17. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried a place that was far off, and his servants passed beside him, and all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men, which came after him from Gath, and passed on before the king. It's interesting that they came from Gath. These, and I'll try these names again, Cherethites and Pelethites. Well, that may not be the right way to say them. They're associated with groups of Philistines. Now, the Philistines had had their kings, and David had certainly had his trouble with the Philistines. He had fought them on more than one occasion since he'd become king. And Goliath himself was of Gath. And yet these people are now aligned with David. They must have looked the situation over and thought, you know, David's doing better for us than our own kings had done. And they were ready to support David here. Then came to the king Ittai, the Gittite. Wheresoever goest thou also with us, return to the place and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger also and an exile. In other words, Ittai, you don't need to come with us, says you're not one of us. And he says, whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us, seeing I go whither I may? Return thou, and take back thy brethren. Mercy and truth be with thee. He didn't really have anything against Ittai, but he thought, well, he just kind of recently arrived on the scene, and he's not really one of us. Why should he go with us? And Ittai answered the king and said, as the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there also will thy servant be. He swore his loyalty to David. And David accepted that. David said to Ittai, go and pass over. And Ittai the Gittite passed over with all his men and all the little ones that were with him. So you've got these Philistines now that have come with David, and they're going to escape into the wilderness with him. And then all the country wept with a loud voice, at 2 Samuel 15:23, wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron. And all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And lo, Zadok also, and all the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. Here you've got Zadok and Abiathar, priests, and they're going to bring the ark with them when David escapes Jerusalem. The king said to Zadok, carry back the ark of God into the city. And he's willing to just submit himself to the Lord for what the Lord would do. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me again. and show me both it and his habitation. But if he say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here I am. Let him do with me as seemeth good unto him. And the king said also unto Zadok the priest, Art thou not a seer? Now, a seer is a prophet. They can see things that others couldn't see. Now, I don't know if they visually saw it unless they received visions. They were told by God of things that would come to pass. That's why they're called a seer. So we have Zadok here. He's also a priest and a seer. He says, Return to the city in peace, and your 2 sons with you, Ahimaaz thy son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. And I think I may have been using Abiathar. Who have I been saying? Was it Abiathar? I hope I've been saying Abiathar. Okay, I think I have been. It's hard to keep all these names straight, isn't it? It's even hard for your preacher too, so don't worry. Let's try to keep them straight as we can here. Verse 28. See? I will tarry in the plain of the wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. He's got these 2 priests, Zadok and Abiathar, and there's 2 sons. And they're going to be in the city kind of watching out what's going to happen. And they'll let David know. Zadok, therefore, and Abiathar carried the ark of God again to Jerusalem, and they tarried there. And David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet, and wept as he went, up, and had his head covered, and he went barefoot, and all the people that was with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went. And so they're in mourning, having their heads covered up, and they going barefoot, and just kind of making their way up to indicate that they are grieving over this fact that they're having to leave Jerusalem in this manner. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators. Now, Ahithophel had been David's counselor. He'd gone over to the side of Absalom, and David was worried about that. David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. And it came to pass, when David was come to the top of the mount, where he worshiped God, before Hushai, the Archite, came to meet him with his coat rent and earth on his head, again indicating mourning. And to whom David said, If thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden to me. Makes me think that Hushai may not have been in the best of health. Maybe he's an older man, and maybe he wasn't going to be able to keep up with David as he's trying to manage and play. And you'll just be a burden if you come along with me. And David has something better for Hushai to do. But if thou return to the city, and say unto Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto, so will I now also be thy servant. Then mayest thou for me defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And we're going to see that take place in another chapter. And hast thou not there with thee Zadok and Abiathar the priest? Therefore it shall be that whatsoever thing thou shalt hear out of the king's house, thou shalt tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Behold, they have there with them their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them ye shall send unto me everything that ye can hear. So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city, and Absalom came to Jerusalem. You've seen those stories you've been watching on TV, and just when it gets good, they say to be continued. And so that's where we're going to drop off here at this chapter. Things are set up, but notice how David is set. He's got some army men with him. He's got some soldiers that can fight with him. And he's got some men planted in Jerusalem to keep up with what's going on. Give David word And so David is going to have a counter conspiracy to be able to defeat Absalom in his conspiracy. Now, these are the men we talked about, David and Absalom. His counselor David, the one on his side, Hushai, the one on Absalom's side, Ahithophel, and then these other men here on David's side. And then here's the spy network. Hushai, he's the one that's going to be in on the council meetings. He's going to report to Zadok and Abiathar. They're going to get their word to their two sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, and they'll be the ones to carry the news to David. So David knows what Absalom is going to try to do. Well, that ends the chapter, and we'll end the lesson here tonight. I just love these stories, and I like teaching them. In fact, just going through the Bible like this is probably one of my favorite ways to teach. And it's so interesting and intriguing how these stories play out and who gets involved and who happens to show up later in the story and what role. And we're going to see some surprises as we move forward in this into the next few chapters. But I do want to offer an invitation every time we gather together. We need to stay close to God. If we have sinned and brought reproach on this church, we need to get that right. If we have not been baptized, there's maybe, like some do, maybe think, well, maybe I don't remember just why I was baptized, or maybe I knew I was baptized for something different than what the Bible says. We need to get that right. And we don't always know just what's on people's minds. And it's just good for us also to always remember that that's why we're here, to help people come to God. And so this tradition we have of offering this invitation at every service is one that I think is a good one to do. I don't know that that's always necessary to do, but I like to be able to offer it at every service. And we're going to offer it tonight. And if you need to respond to God's invitation, let's do it as we stand and sing the invitation song.